What measurements should we collect as part of our testing process? When it comes to web applications, there are two key metrics that we want to examine in order to measure their performance. The first one is referred to as time to first byte, or in Visual Studio it's often referred to as first byte time. In any event, this is the metric that determines how quickly the server sends back the first byte of a response to a given page request. A related metric to this is called the time to last byte, which in Visual Studio is referred to as response time. This includes the time for the initial response, as shown in the first request, as well as all of the time required to get all dependent requests, including images, CSS files, and script files. In addition to performance metrics, we also want to consider load metrics when we're performing a load test. So what should we measure with regard to our load test? The first and most important metric is going to be the user load itself. This corresponds to how many users are being simulated in accessing the system at a given time. With a typical load test, this number will either be static for the duration of the test, or it will ramp up over some period of time. Related to this metric is the current requests per second that are hitting the system. Usually the number of requests per second will vary very closely with the user load, although if the user load starts to exceed the capacity of the system, oftentimes the requests per second will taper off while the user load continues to increase. The third metric, which is sometimes overlooked, is the errors per second of the system. It turns out that IIS and other web servers are very efficient at serving up errors. And so if you were to make a change to your system that introduced, for example, a 500 or a 404 error to your web application, you might then find that your requests per second that you could sustain went up very dramatically, or that your page response time was suddenly much lower than it had been previously. If you were not tracking the errors per second counter, you might determine that whatever change you had just made had a dramatic performance increase on the system. And in fact it has, as long as it's not important to your users that the system actually work. So it's important that you always remember to track the errors per second, and that you throw away any load test that has a significant number of errors as part of its recording. The third category of metric that we need to examine when performing load testing is the actual resource utilization of the servers involved. When looking at the resources being utilized by each server, we need to consider the CPU, the memory, as well as the disk and network capacity that is involved. It's important that we look at all areas of the system under test, including the web servers and database servers involved, but also the test machines themselves. That is, any test agents or test controllers that are being used to perform the test. If there are bottlenecks or insufficient resources on these machines, it can affect how accurately our simulation of user load is for the purposes of our test. When looking at the system under test, we also want to examine the CPU and memory in order to determine what the capacity of the system is. If any of these metrics show that the resource is being completely consumed, this may be showing us a particular bottleneck of the system. However, even when the system's resources are at nominal levels, they can give us some indication of the total capacity of the system by telling us how much room it has to grow.